Thank you very much for coming back for the third talk of the day. My name's Shane Collins. I live in Frome, and I'm a district councillor on Mendip, and just got elected as a county councillor on Somerset. And my daytime job is putting on a festival called the Green Gathering, which is about the only renewably powered festival in the country. And aims to change people's lives by example and giving them the chance to see what it's like to live outdoors for 3 or 4 or 5 days without using fossil fuels other than for a bit of cooking. So this talk originates from the Extinction Rebellion events in Trafalgar Square, and somebody said, well, what can we actually do now? Which got me thinking, obviously the main thing about Extinction Rebellion, the main thing about the climate crisis is that we have such a short period of time left that it's only the government that can make the massive regulatory changes we need in the next 2 or 3 years to avoid the tipping points. And so, whilst we can all do our bit, and we have to do our bit because it's frankly hypocritical to ask the government to do something that we are not doing. But I don't want to give you any misimpressions that simply by us individually changing our behaviour, that is going to make the difference. That is going to cause the 90% cuts we need in CO2 emissions in the next sort of 9-10 years. But it's really important that we do these things ourselves and then put pressure on the government. So this is, in a way, it's a little bit of a sort of a refresher course on the problems leading to the climate crisis. We'll start with the systemic problems that our particular breed of global corporate capitalism has led us into. And very simply, we live in a world of finite resources, one planet. Global capitalist system is basically about digging up things out of the ground, making them into products and selling them, and keep on doing that. The idea of the closed loop economy that we were talking about in the recycling talk an hour ago, that doesn't really feature. That's a problem. And obviously the resources on the planet are finite. So whether it's uranium, whether it's oil, gas, rare metals, whatever, at some stage they are going to run out. And you may remember back in the 70s there was talk about peak oil, and then Alaska oil fields were discovered, North Sea oil was discovered. That sort of pushed peak oil back to the noughties, and then fracking was discovered as a technique. So although the actual capacity for conventional oil and conventional gas has pretty much leveled out and is starting to drop, fracking has brought a whole new amount of gas into the system and has staved off this peak oil time, although we're still getting pretty close to it. The second problem of the system is pollution, and the main obvious problem is greenhouse gases, predominantly carbon dioxide, methane, and various others that cause climate change. And Sir David King, the ex-chief government scientist, saying that he said this last year, in fact, we had 3 to 4 years to make huge changes to avoid the tipping points. That doesn't mean to say that in 3 or 4 years the whole climate is going to collapse, but it does mean that if we leave making these changes longer than 3 or 4 years, or now 2 or 3 years, we won't be able to avoid those tipping points. Okay, and it's worth just reflecting on what those tipping points are. There's probably about 12 to 15 main tipping points around the world. The one that is coming closest to us is the North Pole ice cap melting in the summer. So the NOAA, the basic estimate in the 2030s, the summer ice cap on the Arctic will go. They reckon about 2034, about 12, 13 years. Okay, there will be no summer ice cap on the North Pole. What will that mean? The albedo effect, I presume you all remember from school geography. When you've got a white ice sheet, it reflects the sun back. when you've got a dark ocean, it takes the heat in. And that will likely cause further warming of the Arctic Ocean, which will lead to thinner ice all year round, and it will lead to methane hydrates, which on the seabed and in the sediments pressed down in the seabed, it will lead to the methane hydrates to become a gas again and to bubble up. In deep water, that's not a huge, well, it's a problem, but there's generally bacteria in the sea that will eat the methane as it bubbles up. But on the East Siberian Shelf, in particular the Laptev Sea, where the sea is only 50, 70 meters deep, there's no time for the bacteria to eat this methane as it plumes up. And you may have seen photos of bits of the Arctic of just sort of bubbles coming up. You may have seen photos of sort of lakes in Canada with ice on them. They've had methane bubbling up under the ice, and then if you put a pickaxe in it and light it, you get this vast methane flame. So that's one of the most worrying tipping points. That, and you know, if you think there's probably about 5 million tons of methane in the atmosphere at the moment, a very well-known Russian scientist called Maria Sukhova, who's been studying the East Siberian Shelf for years, reckons there's about 50 gigatons of methane stored as a solid, as a hydrate on the sea floor. So when that starts bubbling up, you know, that's real terror times. That could be a sort of a degree centigrade in a year, you know, definitely to be avoided. The other part of the sort of forecast, David King talks about by 2050, sea level rise will mean that much of the rice growing areas of East Asia, of sort of southern China, Thailand, Cambodia, Indonesia, as well as Bangladesh, those rice growing areas will be flooded by the sea, a big wave or whatever, hurricane. Once you've got seawater on rice growing areas, you can't grow rice anymore there. So David King is suggesting by about 2050, much of those rice growing areas of East Asia will be inundated temporarily or permanently by salt water. That will be about 200 or 300 million people having to move to more arable areas. It will probably mean rice will cease to be an internationally tradable commodity, and there'll be a lot of people moving about. Just to take the weather forecast a little bit further, 2070, Professor Tim Lenton from Exeter University, we had speaking at Glastonbury, he's positing that by that stage, the sort of latitudes around North Africa, Middle East, Northern India, Southern United States, they will have so many days a year that the temperature is over 40 degrees centigrade to basically make it unarable on that sort of latitude. And Professor Lenton reckons that will be about another 1.3 billion people having to move away to areas that can support agriculture and therefore people. So, you know, that's another huge problem with the current system. And the third problem is inequality. You know, capitalism is not a very fair system. We've probably got a greater wealth inequality at the moment, greater than the time of the pharaohs. And that's sort of borne out by the richest 10% of the world's population are producing around 50% of the CO2 emissions. Okay, so that's around 740 million people around the world who are producing more than half of the emissions. And I would suggest that's probably most people in this country. So, you know, we really need to look in the mirror for the solutions here. And you know, similarly that's borne out in air flights, the most damaging form of pollution. 15% of the British population consume 70% of the air flights. Half the British population don't fly at all. So, you know, the inequality in our system is huge, and that's borne out. You just think of basic tax rates. You know, capital gains tax generally is 20%. On labour, income tax is 40%. Why is that fair? Why should somebody who sells their labour be taxed at basically double the rate from somebody who just makes money from investments, makes money from capital. So that's a very quick run through of the problems of this sort of corporate system of capitalism that we are living under at the moment. How can we cut the pollution? And also, obviously I haven't talked about all other sorts of pollution, pesticides, overuse of fertilizers, the insects dropping 75% in Germany in one study. I think anecdotally we all don't see insects on our windscreens anymore. We are part of an ecological crisis. We are involved in the 6th mass extinction, and many species are going out of becoming extinct, and humans don't have a God-given right to continue our existence. There is a danger that in many parts of the world human existence won't be possible. So how can we change these things? We need to make huge step changes in the next 2 to 3 years, and we need to encourage government to make those mandatory, change the regulations very quickly. So just a quick run through food. We have a very simple choice, really. You can go to the supermarket, you can get high mileage food in plastic containers, which has been generally required you to drive there, all the way along the route. It's a very high emitting way of buying food. And even though after you bought it, you put it in the recycling, some might get recycled, some might get incinerated, but both of them have heavy carbon dioxide emissions or greenhouse gas emissions. And so the choice is really clear. You can go down the supermarket route, or as we were discussing earlier on, you can get milk delivered in glass bottles, you can get a veg box delivered to your door in paper bags or cardboard boxes. You can grow some of your own, you can get involved in community-supported agriculture. There's a really simple choice between a green way of buying food and a fossil fuel heavy way of buying food. And in this country, we have about 85% of the population use supermarkets. It's one of the highest in the world, and it produces huge outputs in terms of pollution. Housing, again, I'm a councillor, I'm involved in planning. It's appalling, the standards we have in our housing. If I could take you back 10 years ago, the Conservatives had a great policy of all new houses should be passive house standard, i.e. requiring extremely little energy to build. They got pressure from the housing developers, who after all donate about 20% of the funds to the Conservative Party. The housing developers basically made them drop that target, and we still have appalling planning standards. In Mendip we're constantly battling the developers, trying to turn them down if they don't put in heat pumps or solar panels, but we don't have, they can appeal. We'd likely lose the appeal, which will cost Mendip a lot of money, but we are trying, and we're talking to developers and trying to get solar panels in, heat pumps in as standard, this sort of thing, but there's no statutory framework pushing that. We can also do things ourselves in terms of insulation. You may have heard of Insulate Britain, which was making the pretty straightforward demand of just getting all social housing insulated by 2025 and ensuring that all other housing is done by 2030, which would obviously cut our energy requirements hugely, cut our bills hugely, and it was going quite well until 2012, when Cameron and Osborne decided to cut the green crap, as they put it, and so they cut back funding for home insulation. Between 2012 and 2013, the amount of home insulation installations dropped by about 90%, and it's still 85% lower than what it was. So rather like the solar PV industry, that similarly was absolutely decimated. About 12,000 jobs went when the feed-in tariffs were stopped. Again, that was the result of pressure from the big six energy companies, because they didn't want to see people producing their own energy, because then we wouldn't buy energy off the fossil fuel companies. And that sort of links in to energy, as I was saying. You know, if you think that every society throughout history is successful depending upon how it gets its energy supply, and at the most basic level, where all the energy comes from the sun, we may start by eating the food that stores the sun's energy and using that in terms of muscle power. Then we moved on to utilising other people's muscle power through slavery and this sort of thing, and that's when, you know, the pharaohs building the pyramids, this sort of thing. And then we moved on to wood, charcoal, coal, oil, nuclear. But the key thing about having a centralised energy system is that it's like a hierarchy. We're all paying the money to these big energy companies, okay? And that means that the profit is going to one place, so we're getting centralised economics, and when you get centralised economics, you tend to get centralised politics. So what, as Greens and many others, we're aiming for is having decentralised power production. So if anybody got a south or west facing roof, you know, page one is to get solar panels on there. Community run, community owned wind turbines, onshore wind turbines, which are obviously the cheapest form of electricity and the quickest to install, so that we're not paying what was 200 quid a month, probably now 300 quid a month, to a Babylonian fossil fuel company. We are keeping that money within our house, within our community, which will lead to decentralised economics, which will in turn lead to decentralised politics. And I think that's a really key point, but it's very, very easy to forget, because when we think about energy, we just think about price and what the latest advert is from whoever power company it is. But it's really important that we decentralise energy, because that will have lots more effects, as well as that of greenhouse gases. Similarly, transport, you know, really clear choices between a fossil fuel hungry method of transport and a non-polluting mode of transport. I talked about air travel earlier on, which is one of the most intensive ways of travelling. Obviously trains far better, but we still haven't electrified our train system. We've had various appalling transport secretaries who have continually delayed electrifying the system, because, you know, I should say the one good thing that has happened in this country is that a lot of our energy provision has moved away from coal onto offshore wind. And so on a good day, we may get 30-40% of our energy from offshore wind. As I say, onshore wind is because the Conservatives and the energy companies don't like it. The planning, it means that it's very, very open to opposition from people who may not like the view of a wind turbine, because it may bring down property values, or for whatever reason it gives great power to those comments, which means that basically virtually no onshore wind is being built at the moment, and even solar farms are getting a very, very tough time. But, you know, if we could electrify our rail system through onshore wind, solar PV, offshore wind, whatever it is, that would mean train travel would be very, very low carbon. Similarly with cars, you know, there's a clear choice between a fossil fuel car or an electric car. Obviously, an electric car is pointless if it's being charged by fossil fuels, so it's really key that if we have an electric or a hybrid car and we're charging it at home, we're using renewable energy at home, which is, is pretty much the same price as fossil fuels because they are linked. And although obviously renewables are much cheaper to to produce, the marginal cost once you've built the stuff is virtually nothing, whereas the marginal cost for gas and oil, you've got to keep putting gas and oil through it. So it should be a lot cheaper to drive an electric car, but we've got 40 million cars in this country. Quite frankly, there isn't enough road space and rare earth metals for everybody to make that switch over. But I think the new mode of transport that really excites me is electric bicycles, because it's not a car, it's not a bicycle, it's definitely a new mode of transport. And it's really great in Frome to see so many people, in particular retired people. Where I live on Knox Hill, I'm constantly seeing white suited people going bowling with grey hair, white suit, and whizzing up the road. I could just see their heads going past the ball and think, how do they do that? And it's an electric bike. It is a new mode of transport, and younger people are going for cheaper scooters, electric scooters, but again, it's a very clear choice between walking, bicycling, electric cars, fossil fuel cars. Trains should be somewhere in the middle, and then flying. Lastly, money. We live in Britain, we've been kicked off the land, we've been completely divorced from the land. We can't grow our own food in the way that we used to, so we need money. But what do we do with that money? I think money, in a way, it's like a vote. Every day when you spend money, you are in effect making a vote for how you spend it. But there's no good trying to get the government to stop climate change if we're putting our money and our pensions and investments in banks that fund fossil fuels. It's just, it doesn't make logical sense. Now there are perfectly good banks that only invest in good green things, and I find Triodos is the best, and they've just started a current account. They've had an ISA savings account for years. There's one or two other of the old Mutual Building Society, Coventry Building Society is quite good, Unity Bank, which is run by the trade unions for clubs and societies and unions, is pretty good. But from a domestic point of view, so far I find Triodos Bank is a very good way that you're putting your money somewhere where it's safe and you're not supporting fossil fuels. So I've tried to outline the problems of the system, the 5 things within it we've got to change. And there's obviously lots more, but this is an hour's talk or a bit less, not a 5-week lecture. So let's look at how we cause social change. Okay, we know the things we want to change. Some of them we can do them individually. Some of them we need the government to do. How can we change them? So the most obvious thing is consumer choice. Your money is your vote. Where do you vote every day? What sort of food you buy, what sort of energy you buy, what sort of transport you buy, where do you keep your money? So it could, that could also include consumer boycotts. And if you remember the boycott of South African goods during apartheid, very successful in putting pressure on the South African government economically. Similar things going on now at the moment with Israeli products and Russian products. It can cause, it certainly can shift things a bit. And it's, as I was talking here, it's absolutely important that we do regard our money as our daily vote and be logical with where we vote, where we put that money. Second thing is campaign groups, which is basically about building sort of social capital. It could be a union, it could be a day like this, a group that's come together to put on a vote, an event like this. In Frome, we had Frome Hoedown to stop the council spraying Roundup and glyphosate, which obviously kills insects from rivers and our gut biome. There's really no limit, whether it's a Green Party group of Greenpeace, Friends of the Earth, XR, Lib Dems, Conservatives, whoever. but it's really important that we act as a group to try and push political change. The third thing is elections. We have a general election once every 4 years. Obviously, from a Green point of view, it takes a system to hold us back. We have an appalling system of first past the post here, still about, I think, one of the few remaining countries certainly in Europe that does, if not the world, have our sort of version of it. And that's held us back dramatically. I just want to take you back to 1989 when I first got involved in the Green Party, and when climate change first started to become an issue. That European election in 1989, the Greens in Britain got 15% of the vote. Fantastic vote. But because then the British government still used had first past the post for the European elections, we got no MEPs at all. Contrast with the Germans, they got 12% of the vote in the European elections in 1989. Because they had proportional representation, they got something like 25 or 30 MEPs or something like that. And they really put the Greens on the map in Germany and in Europe. And so the system we have at the moment is extremely bad for letting new ideas come through. We still obviously have council elections, and Greens do get elected in council elections. We have 10 Greens on Mendip, we have 5 on Somerset, but you need a dozen committed people, 20 or 30 or 40 people delivering leaflets, and you can change the system on a smaller level. But on a general election level, the Greens have got one MP, the fantastic Caroline Lucas in Brighton. Very, very hard to reproduce elsewhere. So, it's hard for me to argue that through elections we are going to make these changes we need that David King talks about in the next 2 or 3 years. We probably won't have a general election until 2024 at the latest. The next thing is protest. So this is sort of the slightly boring A to B protests, using, or it could be like the road protests in the 90s, aiming to use the media to shift public opinion, to shift political opinion. All right, and an example as regards energy, and I was saying earlier, one of the success stories in Britain is cutting out coal. How did that come about? Take your mind back to the noughties, I think it was 2008, the Camp for Climate Action, which was a sort of spin-off of Reclaim the Streets, took to occupying places where bad things were happening for a good week or two. So Drax, to stop Drax expanding and burning more coal and then wood, Heathrow to stop another runway, but also Kings North coal-fired power station. In, I think it was 2007 or 2008, the Labour government was about to build another 12 coal-fired power stations. That was their solution then to the energy crisis, to the fact that nuclear was getting old and would have to wind down. So they were going to build 12 new coal-fired power stations, knowing what they did about CO2 emissions and all that. So the Camp for Climate Action occupied the area around Kings North Power Station. We had canoes coming down. My part of the role was to get 20 canoes secretly down from London to the Medway, and then people went off in the canoes and blockaded the power station by water. And we tried to cause as much fuss as possible, using the media to alert the politicians. Now, there was lots of other things going on as well, but I would argue that that was definitely a factor in persuading Ed Miliband, the then Environment Secretary, to say, okay, you can only have new coal-fired power stations if they are 25% carbon capture and storage. And that was the end of new generation of coal-fired power stations, because as you probably know, carbon capture and storage, rather like nuclear fission, has been the idea around the corner for about 25, 30 years now. The only example is a small power station in Canada where it's basically the net result is it's made the power station about 15% less efficient because of all the scrubbers and carbon capture on it. So, you know, carbon capture and storage it may in the future become an economic and valuable technology. I hope it does, but at the moment it isn't, and at the moment we're betting the farm on it. Now, if you understand net zero, the government's net zero policy, the idea is basically to allow companies to carry on emitting in the hope that in the future carbon capture and storage and biomass from energy from biomass will take up the slack. And that obviously means, as like Drax is doing, is cutting loads of old growth forests from the United States and Europe. And it's basically kicking the can down the road onto future generations who are going to have to deal with the mess that we have unfortunately left them. But you know, Kingsnorth was an example where protests did shift public opinion through the media and did shift political opinion. Moving on to civil resistance, which is a sort of a step on from protest. It's not so much aiming to influence things in the short term, it's aiming to change a big government policy or change the government. And the 3.5% refers to what's known as the 3.5% rule. Very good academic from Harvard called Erica Chenoweth, who's looked into post-Second World War revolutions and looked at why they have failed or succeeded. And the sign of success is being completely peaceful, right, avowedly peaceful. It's getting 3.5% of the population into the main city square and staying there for as long as possible. And what quite often happens is the government or the security forces overreact, start shooting people, jailing people, whatever it is. That gets the sympathy of the other 20-30% of the population who were sympathetic but distracted at the time and brings them out. And that seems to be, post-Second World War, the way to a successful revolution or a successful large change of government policy. And then, well, in between warfare, there is damage to property that causes damage to the planet. Okay, Andreas Malm, Swedish academic, book just come out. We had speaking at Glastonbury as well, called "How to Blow Up a Pipeline?" ? And he's making the ethical argument that if equipment is damaging our life support systems, do we have an ethical or a moral right to damage that equipment? And we're not talking about people at all, absolutely non-violent towards people, but part of the problem is that the meaning of violence has got slightly muddled up. You know, when we use a machine to cut down a tree, we don't conventionally see that as violence. But when we see a shop window getting smashed in the media, that's reported as violence. I would argue that violence is to do with individuals towards individuals. And whilst you can certainly argue that violence to nature is extremely damaging in many ways, it's harder to argue that damage to a piece of equipment that is destroying our life support system is violent. And Andreas Malm is putting the question: is it ethical? Is it moral? Do we let it just go on and let our life support systems be destroyed? Or do we make a stand like they're doing in Canada with the old growth forests there, which are being cut down hugely? They've taken to people with masks just destroying the machinery, but then, different to protests, not claiming responsibility for it. Okay, A lot of protest and civil resistance is doing something and then putting your hands up and saying, I've done this, I'm prepared to accept the consequences of jail for it. And we spoke about Insulate Britain earlier on. There is quite a few people from Insulate Britain who are going in and out of jail, and there's more coming up. And similarly for Just Stop Oil, there will be more people coming out and going into jail as court cases come up. And then, the conventional way of changing things is warfare, which obviously I'm not advocating at all, but it's good to remember that that's what our government advocates. We have been involved in a lot of wars recently. Libya, we were bombing in Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq. So I'm putting this just for reference of that's how governments tend to change things. Obviously we had, recently we've had sort of terrorism, IRA and various terrorist groups using limited forms of warfare, using violence against people. But the conventional way that governments change things is using warfare. As I say, I'm actually not advocating that, but I'm putting it there partly to make these other things seem more reasonable, but just to remind ourselves what is done in our name a lot of the time. So I just want to finish by just saying, change is inevitable. We as a civilization, is going to be pretty unrecognisable in the next 10, 20, 30, 40 years unless we make huge changes. But we must be under no illusions that if we carry on as we are with our fairly meagre net zero targets, certainly they're better in Britain than they are in a lot of other places, and they are statutory. We have to get to net zero by 2050. We have to make 78% cuts by 2035. But that alone is not going to be enough, because it's based on BECCS, on biomass, energy, carbon capture and storage, this idea that we can carry on emitting now, we will invent carbon capture and storage, or our children will, or they will fry. So change is absolutely inevitable, but what's not inevitable is the direction of change. I think we all know that living a green, more communitarian, community-based lifestyle is a far, far better alternative, economically, mentally, for the future of our kind. So change is inevitable, but the direction of change really is not. And I guess like me, we all probably feel a bit guilty that 30 years ago, when we really could have made a difference, we didn't. We got distracted. Okay, and I've got a 13-year-old daughter. I don't even want to talk to her about this, because it's so horrible. And at that age, I think it's quite hard for children to contemplate. But I know that in a few years' time, we are all going to have to talk to our children, our grandchildren, whatever. And unless we shape up, the message we're giving them is absolutely horrible. It is an exploding time bomb. So, yeah, but we do have, 2 or 3 years to try and avoid those tipping points. And it's up to us to decide not so much which of these, because there's no point just going for civil resistance, or just going for elections, or just going for consumer choice, because on their own they won't make the change required in the timescale we have. It has to be as many of these as we possibly can. And civil resistance, sitting on the road, for quite a lot of people, what you see on TV of people occupying oil refineries or sitting on the M25 or whatever, it seems pretty scary. But you've got to remember that behind those 10, 15 people sitting on the road, there are a whole nother team, a whole bigger team that are doing background support, that are going to meet people when they come out of prison at 5 in the morning with a cup of tea, who are writing letters, who are organising this, that or the other. You know, there are so many different things to be done, so I wouldn't want you to be put off by the fear of getting arrested. And I would actually, you know, part of the things about these, you do it as a team, and the fear of getting arrested, when you talk about it as a group and when you realise you've got a support network behind you, the fear of getting arrested decreases. You only get arrested if you want to. The police always say, would you like to move? But there is no doubt that one of the ways to get the government to change is for more and more people to take part in direct action, for the prisons to be filled, and you know, the civil rights movement in America, in Birmingham, Alabama, a classic example. You know, what we're doing now is nothing new. Yeah, if you think of the suffragettes who taught Gandhi when Gandhi was in London, who went to South Africa and went to India, formulated movements, taught people there, that message was taken up by the civil rights movement in the States. Those were messages and learnings were taken up by the anti-nuclear movement here, by the anti-roads protests here. And you know, a lot of those things won. We've got to remember the anti-roads protests, we beat them. We stopped the Conservative Party's road building programme. Yeah, we stopped a whole new generation of genetically modified food, Terminator seeds, which would have led to the few agricultural companies controlling more and more and more. So through a combination of these things, we have been winning on a lot of areas, a lot of fronts. We're faced now with the biggest threat, that of climate and that of keeping parts of the world arable so that we can feed the world's population, now what, 7.4, 7.6 billion. But yeah, a lot to do. So yes, just, you know, as I said, change is inevitable. The direction of change isn't. That is up in the air. That's up to us. So any questions?
Hi. I'd like to suggest that in achieving change, you're missing out a really key ally or set of allies, which is civil servants and the employees of local government. Here we have one example here, and we had a really good example from the guy from Somerset Waste Partnership this afternoon. There's a huge amount of well-intentioned professional expertise working within government with a big opportunity to be a little bit subversive. So some of the changes you've highlighted, like, I can't remember what you said now, about the reduction in road building and no GM. Those are European laws made by insiders within European governments and European Commission, MEPs, you know, that kind of thing.
Reacting
so it's best you can also, well, of course, partly reacting to protests, etc., but also reacting to very well researched scientific stuff, and also, crucially, good practice in other places. So when you're in a local government, you also have the opportunity to share your experience with other places and to actually see, for example, why are there so many bikes in Copenhagen? You work with the city of Copenhagen and you see what they've done. And then you work out whether you could do some of that here. You know, so you're making common cause, and we're doing it today at this event. Just a group of villagers and well-intentioned people talking about what's going on in their local areas and sharing the expertise, and you can achieve some change that way. So it's not just about direct action and protest, but working cleverly within the system and recognising that a lot of people employed by government are actually very well professionally trained. Their professional organisations have drummed into them all sorts of stuff, which includes a lot of stuff about climate. And just finally to say that the climate crisis is also about the need to adapt to the consequences of climate change. And on that one, the UK government is certainly failing in not requiring local government to produce strategies for adaptation and resilience. There's a certain amount in the planning legislation, but there are places around here who are saying we're not making an adaptation strategy because the government hasn't asked us to and we don't have the direct funding to do it. You know, bonkers, because a lot of what's already happening with green space and things like that is of course part of what we need to do. So I think you need to add the adaptation stuff into the climate crisis.
Yeah, yeah, no, fair point. I mean, I hope that well, maybe I didn't mention it enough within the sort of campaign groups, and but yeah, no, councils are, you know, doing good stuff, but you know, the austerity policies we've had since 2012, 60% of those have been pushed onto local councils because people aren't going to blame the central government so much, they're going to blame the councils. So 60% of the austerity cuts have been pushed on local councils. But, you know, I'd absolutely echo that point. There are a lot of very good, very frustrated people in local government trying to do the right thing. And as councillors, you know, and we're blessed with a Conservative Party councillor, Lib Dem councillor, as well as Green councillors, you know, we do have common cause on this, and that's being borne out by the motions we've got through MENDIP to do with the climate and ecological emergency and have cross-party support. Shannon.
Well, I'd like to see more people champion their local councils and challenge them to take better action, because although we get motions put through, then I've lost 5 woodlands, I'm not beating my drum, 5 woodlands in the last 2 years to people who want to develop and have monetary greed at the top of their agenda and not the environment. And the council have done nothing, and it hasn't been promoted